So, as you can see, we have a low pressure system moving in, and that could result in a 30 to 40% chance of precipitation later in the week. But other than that, it's sunny skies all around. So, that's all we have for the weather. Back to you in the studio. Thank you, David, for that insightful report. Now, we all know that all living things are made up of cells. But the question is, how do they actually work? Well, we're going live to our operative in the field, also called David, in fact, who will be explaining us how cells work, or more specifically, how plant cells work, and the structures within them. Over to you, David. Thanks, David. Now, as you can see, I am standing here just outside a plant cell. You can see it just in the background, right behind me. Now, the interesting thing about cells is they're not all one big unit. It's split into small little subunits within the cell, and each of these little subunits is called an organelle. Each of these organelles has a specific function, and they all work together collaboratively to form the entire cell and carry out all the processes that the cell requires. I'm going to hand it over to my live assistant correspondent, David, to talk to you about the first of these organelles present within the plant cell, the cell wall. David? Thank you, David. Now, as you can see, I'm standing just outside of a cell. Now, what you're seeing here is the very outermost layer of a plant cell. It's called the cell wall. So, the cell wall is an organelle, and its duty is literally, as the name implies, it is a wall around the outside of the cell. It's a thick, strong, rigid layer that helps keep the cell secure, and it's made of a combination of cellulose, sugar, and protein. Now, the cell wall has other functions as well. It also controls what enters and leaves the cell. Among other things, water, oxygen, and carbon dioxide enter and leave the cell through the cell wall, through a process called diffusion. Now, the cell wall not only lets these materials through, it also prevents too much of these materials entering the cell. Now, cell walls only appear in plant cells. They don't appear in animal cells whatsoever. Inside the cell wall, we have a cell membrane, which performs another function. So I'll hand it over to our correspondent David, who's inside the cell, to handle that one. David? Hello again, my name is David, and this is the cell membrane. The cell membrane is a thin layer that is inside the cell wall of a plant cell, but outside of the rest of the cell. It effectively marks the boundary of the cell with the cell wall and stops the inside of all of the organelles inside the cell from spilling out. It also protects the interior of the cell from harmful substances. It specifically controls what type of substances can get through in and out of the cell, and anything that could be hazardous or dangerous, it attempts to keep it out. It also helps the cell to keep its shape, but less so than the cell wall. It's much thinner than the cell wall and much more flexible, much weaker, and it's made of a double layer of phospholipids, and it's embedded with little proteins. So that's about it for the cell membrane. So we're going to go back to David, who is inside, and he's looking at the nucleus. Over to you. Thank you, David, and welcome back. This is the nucleus. Now, the word nucleus actually derives from the Latin word nucleus, which means core or kernel. So basically, it is the core, the central part of the cell. Now, it has a few very major functions. One is inside it stores all of the cell's chromosomes, which are wound up strings of DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. This DNA is responsible for deciding how proteins get manufactured and placed, and basically contains information of everything about the cell that it needs to be built. The nucleus is blue and an approximate spherical or oblong shape. On the outside, it is dotted with nuclear pores, which basically serve as pathways for substances to get in and out of the nucleus. The nucleus is responsible for being in charge of the cell, managing the cell, and managing and controlling energy and nutrient metabolism. It is effectively the command center of the entire cell. In the very center of the nucleus, we have an even smaller organelle called the nucleolus. Now, the inside of the nucleus is made of a substance called chromatin. At the very center of that chromatin lies the nucleolus. The nucleolus is a small, also spherical organelle whose primary responsibility is to create RNA, or ribonucleic acid. Now we move on to our high danger correspondent, David, who will be talking to us about the endoplasmic reticulum. So, David, what is the endoplasmic reticulum and what does it do? Well, David, it's actually very interesting because the endoplasmic reticulum is not one but two organelles. It is comprised of two parts. One of them is called the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and the other is called the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. And they are actually attached to each other. So the rough endoplasmic reticulum is attached to the outside of the nuclear membrane, which is the thin layer that surrounds the outside of the nucleus. Now, the rough endoplasmic reticulum is a rough folded up membrane that forms a barrier around the nucleus. It has multiple folded up layers. It manufactures some membranes, but its primary purpose is to manufacture proteins, which are essential for building just about anything inside the cell. In some occasions, it can also create antibodies. Now, the reason it appears rough is because of many ribosomes that are attached to the outside of the organelle. We will be going over ribosomes in more detail later on, but now we're going to move on to the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Now, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, or the SER, is an organelle that is attached to the RER, and it is comprised of a series of smooth tube-like vents. It appears smooth because it doesn't have anything attached to the outside, unlike the RER. Now, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, while it may look like a vent or like some types of corals that you can see commonly whilst snorkeling, its actual responsibility within the cell is the manufacturing of both lipids and carbohydrates, so two very important materials for the cell. And that is about it for the endoplasmic reticulum. So now we're going to be moving on to David, all the way down there, who's going to be talking to us about ribosomes. Thanks, David. Now, here, right behind me, you can see right there, it's a ribosome. So, ribosomes, as previously mentioned, are very small structures that are attached to the rough endoplasmic reticulum. They're actually made of both protein and ribonucleic acid. In fact, their job is to take ribonucleic acid and turn it into proteins. These proteins are then used to build, grow, and expand other organelles. And they're also used when the cell splits to build copies of organelles and create the new cell. There are many of them attached to the outside of the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and there's one right here. They are basically very small little objects that cling on to the rough endoplasmic reticulum and are in fact, as previously stated, what makes it look rough like it does. So now we're just going to move on to our other correspondent, David, who is currently scouting out looking for a mitochondria. Over to you now, David. Right, so it's David here, and you caught me just in time, because I just managed to find a mitochondria. Now, a mitochondria, as you can see, is a long oblong organelle, and it's made out of two membranes. There's one outside membrane, which makes the outside of the organelle, which is that oblong shape, and inside there's a second one, which is twisted round and round and round in the middle. It's all curved over itself multiple times. Now, the purpose of the mitochondria is to create energy for the cell. In this case, the energy it creates is ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, which the cell requires for processes like metabolism and other cellular activities. Now, the way that it combines oxygen with glucose to create adenosine triphosphate is a process called cellular respiration. So, yeah, that's the main purpose of the mitochondria. It is basically the powerhouse for the cell, providing energy for all of the other cell processes. We move on now to another major organelle, the Golgi apparatus. Hello everyone, this is David, and this is the Golgi apparatus. As you can see, it is a series of folded up membranes that get progressively smaller towards the one end. It's packed in very tightly, as you can see, and it's found free floating around the cell, not attached to any other organelles. Its primary duty is to sort, change and package proteins and other substances for transport around the cell. Then it creates vesicles, which are tiny little membrane-bound sacs which store all of the materials inside them. This vesicle then gets transported all the way around the cell, delivered to wherever it needs to go. The entire Golgi apparatus is part of a really complex storing and distribution system within the cell. The Golgi apparatus is also responsible for creating lysosomes. This is the main purpose of the Golgi apparatus. We will now move on to our next organelle. David, over to you. Thank you, David. Now, the next organelle we're going to talk to you about is called the chloroplast. Now, the chloroplast is an organelle that is only found within plant cells. In fact, it is filled with a pigment called chlorophyll, which is green. This chlorophyll is responsible for giving plants their green colour. It is an oblong membrane with an inner membrane folded and wrapped around inside itself. This inner membrane is called the thylakoid, or the thylakoid membrane. These membranes inside is the location where photosynthesis takes place. Now, this comes from words from ancient origins where photo means light and synthesis means to create. So photosynthesis is creating from light. And what it's creating from light, or sunlight, is food. So, in the location where photosynthesis happens, the cell, it takes water up from the soil, usually, and it takes carbon dioxide from the air, brings it in, and using sunlight as energy, it combines them together, and it uses them to create glucose and oxygen. So the actual formula is this. You've got 6 CO2 and 6 H2O That's 6 carbon dioxide atoms and 6 water, or 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules added together equals 1 glucose molecule, C6H12O6, and 6 oxygen molecules, which are of course O2. This oxygen then gets released back into the atmosphere, and the glucose gets broken down and used as energy within the cell. And that is the chloroplast. So without further ado, we're going to move on. So it's over to you now, David, and thank you. Yeah, so that's good. Alright, I'm live, I'll see you later. Hello everyone, and I'm here to talk to you about the next organelle. And this one is called the cytoskeleton. So, unlike the other organelles, this one is a little bit different. Most of the other ones, with the exception of the cell wall and the cell membrane, were small little freestanding or attached organelles that floated within the interior of the cell. This one, on the other hand, is more of a complex network of microfilaments and microtubules that support the cell. Imagine a building under construction. It doesn't have any ceiling, it doesn't have any walls yet. All it has is a gridded framework that holds the building together. There is a similar design, slightly similar design, within the cytoskeleton. It is a complex but strong network of tiny little strands that are made of protein called microtubules and microfilaments that work together to create a structure that helps support the cell and helps it to maintain its shape. It also makes the cell stronger and supports the cell. Now, these little microtubules and microfilaments, they can be laid down along the cell, and they provide almost tracks, sort of like train tracks for all of the nutrients and all the things that need to be transported around the cell can be transported around easily using these tracks. In short, the cytoskeleton has numerous uses and is very important to the cell. Next, we are going to move on to what is usually the largest component in a plant cell, which is the large central vacuole and tonoblast. David? Thank you very much. Yes, well, now we've come to the penultimate organelle within a plant cell that we will be reporting on tonight. So, this one is dun dun dun. Okay, so in a plant cell, as has already been stated, the vacuole is usually the largest organelle within the cell. It takes up a large amount of space. In fact, it's so big in some cells that sometimes it's actually used to support the cell, just because it's so massive. As for its shape, the vacuole is just a large blob, usually, and the large central vacuole in the plant cell, it stores energy, chemicals, food, waste, all sorts of things. It's basically the main supply depot for everything within the plant cell. Now, in the animal cell, it has multiple little vacuoles instead of a great big one. As a result of a great big vacuole, it means that in a plant cell, they would be a bit fragile and they could fall apart a lot more easily. So as a result, they've got a large tonoplast surrounding it. It's basically a membrane, and it's a double layer of phospholipids, which, if you'll recall, is the same substance that the cell membrane was made out of. So, as membranes go, it's very strong, or at that scale, it is especially strong, and it keeps everything required for the cell inside it. And that about wraps it up for the large central vacuole and tonoplast of the plant cell. Now we are going to move on to the ultimate, the final organelle that pretty much literally covers everything within the cell that we haven't already covered, all the spaces between the organelles. Finally, over to you, David. That's right, everyone. It is the cytoplasm. Now, the cytoplasm is basically all the space that's taken up within this cell membrane. Yes, and it's comprised of two parts mainly. You've got the cell organelles, and you've got a sort of gel that everything floats around in called cytosol. Now, cytosol contains vital nutrients that many things within the cell need to survive. So the organelles feed off the nutrients to keep them running and keep them performing cell processes. It takes up all the space within the cell. It means that the cell doesn't collapse on itself and it's being supported at all time. It also provides the interior framework and it supports the organelles where they float within the cell. And that, I'm afraid, wraps it up for plant cells. So, without further ado, let's go back to David, back at the studio. So, David, what do you think? Thank you, David. It is fascinating. It truly is fascinating. But unfortunately, we do not have the time to dwell on it. We are now going on to our latest documentary. What happens when someone employs too many people with the same name? We'll be going over to our out-of-field correspondents, David and David, to find out more. See you next time, guys. Goodbye.